And also, what also started at that point was already the beginnings of depression that I would experience periodically, and living in a state of increasing anxiety, a kind of generalized anxiety. And I was looking for some answer to the dilemma of life and living, and I was looking to philosophy and the intellect for an answer. So I began to read a lot, and then I thought the answers would probably be found at the universities. The professors would know. So I took the exams that I needed in evening classes to get to university, and then I went on to London University, where I did languages and literature, and increasingly became more and more unhappy and continued to search and absorb more and more knowledge and gradually beginning to realize that they didn't really have the answers to life's dilemma. I remember there was one professor at London University that I liked very much. I would go to his classes and admired him, very knowledgeable, and one day we arrived on a Monday morning and we were told that he had just committed suicide. And that shook me inside. And I realized that certainly these people that I had looked to for an answer didn't have it either. And so my depression intensified, and I did very well in the degree examinations because I studied so hard out of fear, really. I was driven by anxiety. And then after graduating from London University, I didn't do anything for about a year, and that was the year in which I became even more unhappy and depressed, and when an inner shift suddenly happened inside me. It was in my 29th year. I woke up in the middle of the night, and this was not uncommon for me, waking up in the middle of the night and feeling intensely depressed and in a state of great fear at the same time. And that happened again that night, and the thought occurred to me, I can't live with myself any longer. And that thought repeated itself in my mind. I can't live with myself. And then suddenly I looked at the thought. I kind of stood back from that thought and looked at it and said, that's a strange thought. I cannot live with myself. Am I one or am I two? This thought seems to show that there's two people here. I and the self that I cannot live with. I didn't have an answer to that question. It's just that question, that puzzle arose in my mind. Much later, it reminded me of a koans that they have in Zen, that are puzzles that are designed to stop the mind. For example, what is the sound of one hand clapping is a famous koan. And it doesn't have an answer on an intellectual level. And so the question that arose in my mind also didn't have an answer on an intellectual level. Who am I and who is myself that I cannot live with? But that question triggered an inner shift. Something inside me, and I didn't understand it at that point, must have disidentified from the self, the unhappy me, as I later called it. So a kind of an inner disidentification happened. The I am, which I later recognized as the consciousness that I am, separated itself from the conditioned entity, the conditioned consciousness that provided me with my sense of identity, the self. And that consisted largely of an unhappy story. So then I felt I was like being drawn into some kind of vortex of energy, as if I were disappearing in that. And there was still a moment of resistance. And I heard something almost like a voice inside me that said, resist nothing. So I gave up resisting the feeling of, almost the feeling of disappearing into nothingness. And so that, don't remember very much else of that night. All I know is that the next morning I woke up and I opened my eyes and I looked around the room, and everything seemed as if I was seeing it for the first time. Fresh, new, alive. The light coming through the windows, familiar objects on the table. They looked fresh, new, and alive. So I got up and went out for a walk, and I looked around, and everything seemed so peaceful. Even the traffic in the city seemed so peaceful, and I knew something strange had happened. There was suddenly, everything was filled with aliveness and peace, and I didn't know why. And that went on, and then this inner peace as the background to all experiences and the background to all sense perceptions, even as the background to my thinking, that then never really left me again. But it took me a long time to understand it, to be able to put it into words. And so a little later I started investigating other spiritual teachings, for the first time Buddhism, Christianity, and more contemporary spiritual teachings. And very quickly I recognized the truth that is in many cases hiding underneath sometimes centuries of cultural additions, interpretations and misinterpretations. And I could see the truth that's in Buddhism, that's in Christianity, the original teachings. And in turn, they shed light on what had happened to me. For example, I picked up the New Testament and I read Jesus' words, "The peace that passes all understanding." I said, that's exactly what I feel. I have this peace and I don't understand what it is. So he must have had the same experience. Peace suddenly arose, which was not causally related to anything in the external world. It wasn't caused by something wonderful happening in my external environment. So it didn't seem to have a cause, an external cause. And then later I visited Zen teachers and so on, and again I recognized the truth of Zen immediately, but they also helped me to understand and put what had happened to me into a wider context. For example, I remember talking to one Buddhist monk who said, who talked about coming to the end of always having to thinking. And he said, Zen is about not thinking, ultimately. And I immediately realized something that strangely, I hadn't realized before, that my thought processes, ever since that happened that night, had become reduced by maybe 80%. So I wasn't actually thinking that much anymore. And that's why there was so much peace. So I realized the continuous mental noise, as I now call it, which is the compulsive and largely useless thinking that most people are continuously engaged in, that had come to an end. There would still be some thought, and I could use thinking when I needed it, and occasionally thoughts would come in and out, but there were huge stretches of no thought. And in those long gaps and intervals of no thought, there was that wonderful experience of inner peace. And I realized that inner peace had been there before, even when I was still anxious, but had simply been covered up by the anxiety, by the hyperactive mind. And so this then gradually developed into a spiritual teaching. So the spiritual teaching now attempts to show people that they have within themselves already what they may perhaps are looking for on the outside. the aliveness, the peace, the sense of deep inner fulfillment is already present in every human being as their innermost essence. So it's not a question of needing to obtain or acquire something new, which is often what spiritual seekers are looking for. Everybody is looking for to acquire something to fulfill him or herself. They may be looking for it on a material level, or on the level of experiences, or on the level of accumulating knowledge, or accumulating wealth, or spiritual seekers want to add more spiritual experiences to who they are, or find themselves at some point in the future. And you can't, because if you're looking to the future to find yourself, you're missing yourself already, the essence of your being, which you can only find in the now. So my realization that night took me years to understand, and in the process of understanding it, at the same time, people would already come to me occasionally and ask questions. So gradually I was able to talk about it, and I was able to recognize in others what I had been through. It's the same dilemma, perhaps with the exception that I was suffering from it more acutely than many others. That's all. I was even more deeply immersed in the mental noise and the emotional turmoil than would be normal. But the same mechanism operates in everyone. So the teaching now is to point out that there is a dimension in you that is deeper than what you normally identify with as yourself, that is deeper than the me, the personal history that most people believe is who they are. And so the recognition of that dimension comes when you make room inside yourself for the present moment.